Welcome everyone to this end of week one roundup for our online Jane Austen course with the University of Southampton via FutureLearn. My name is Gillian Dow and I'm one of the lead educators on this course, and I've been really enjoying getting to see how you're reacting to the material this week. This is the third time that this course has run this year. And it's been a funny old year globally. In March, when we ran the course, it was the start of the first lockdown in Britain and indeed in many other countries in Europe. And people were joining us from self-isolation, from furlough because they were out of work, because they were shut up and looking for something to do. And that's the case this time too, I think. So on a somber note, I wish you well and good health at the end of this strangest of strange years. We always enjoy seeing participants' comments on this course and to see how you're reacting to the material. And we do our best to try and answer some of your direct questions in the weekly roundup, as well as going through the course. So you'll see me on the boards, you'll see my colleague, Dr. Kim Simpson, another lead educator, and you'll see two of our PhD students at the University of Southampton, both in English. Emma Hills and Cleo O'Sullivan are both joining us this time. So the four of us will be doing our very best to answer your questions and queries and just provoke discussion and exchange as you go along. We all enjoy teaching on this course and we hope you're enjoying it too. So this week we got you to think about Austen education and reading. We got you to think about what Austen would have read. We got you to think about the education of men and women in the period. And I thought I'd start by giving you a little extract from a novel that we didn't get you to think about in much detail this week, but that's really quite interesting in terms of both education and reading. And that's Northanger Abbey. One of Austen's first novels to be written and one of the first she attempted to get published as Susan originally, but of course it wasn't published until after she died. So it was published at the very end of 1817, came out with 1818 on the title page. The heroine is Catherine Morland, and in volume 1, chapter 1, we get something of a description of Catherine Morland's education. Mrs. Morland was a very good woman and wished to see her children everything they ought to be. But her time was so much occupied in lying in and teaching the little ones that her elder daughters were inevitably left to shift for themselves. And it was not very wonderful that Catherine, who had by nature nothing heroic about her, should prefer cricket, baseball, riding on horseback and running about the country at age of 14 to books, or at least books of information. For, provided that nothing like useful knowledge could be gained from them, provided they were all story and no reflection, she never had any objection to books at all. But from 15 to 17, she was in training for a heroine. She read all such works as heroines must read to supply their memories with those quotations which are so serviceable and so soothing in the vicissitudes of their eventful lives. I love that because it's really, it sets down very clearly a lot of what's at stake in Austen's novels. There's an anxiety around novel reading there, isn't there? It's very tongue-in-cheek. We know that Jane Austen herself said of her family, we are great novel readers and not ashamed of being so. But you get here the idea that Catherine herself is only reading novels. She's not reading any improving literature at all. We also get the sense just how much education for girls in particular is down to the circumstances of their individual families. So Catherine's education and her sister's education is being neglected because Mrs. Morland herself is continuously pregnant, continuously recovering from giving birth. And we see that idea repeated, of course, with the Bennet girls who've been left to shift for themselves without a governess and learn, basically educating themselves through their reading. And that's something that we try to draw out in this section of the course, is what an 18th century education was and what how Jane Austen herself was educated. And we give you access, of course, to a variety of online resources that help you think through that. The Godmersham Park Library catalogue now online, and the Reading with Austen website, I think, is a fantastic resource. Please remember that this is Jane Austen's brother's library in Kent. It's not a library that Jane Austen had access to in her youth. It's a library she had access to when she was an older woman. She certainly used it. We know she did. There are letters from her in the library. We know that there are works that she read in the library collection there, but it's not a library that she had access to when she was younger. And it's not the library at Chawton House. It's a library at Godmersham Park in Kent. But it's been really interesting to see how you're engaging with this material and sort of surprise at some of the works that are in there, and indeed some of the works that are not. So great many of you are very surprised at the amount of foreign language material in there, particularly French. There's a lot of French material in the Godmersham Park Library collection. I can tell you that it's very clear that some of the voluminous volumes of French memoirs don't seem to have had any readers at all. But it's interesting that they were purchased for the collection there. And also some of you are surprised at how very little poetry there was, particularly the poetry of Austen's contemporaries. So no Wordsworth, no Coleridge. That kind of new romantic material didn't make its way into the Country House Library. If you would like to follow up this sort of idea of the English Country House Library, I recommend very highly Mark Purcell's book on the Country House Library. Mark Purcell was the librarian for the National Trust here in England for many, many years, and he focuses on those kind of collections, those gentlemen's country house libraries in that book. I think you will get a lot out of it if you can get hold of a copy of that. So that's Jane Austen's reading that you've all been thinking about, and thinking about what Austen's reading might tell you about her writing and the importance of reading in Austen's novels more generally. We have a task that gets you to think about what it might say about a character that they like 50 Shades of Grey above another kind of writing. I mean, I think these are quick signifiers in fiction, aren't they? There are many cases in Austen's novels. Northanger Abbey is a very good example, where a love of Gothic literature, of the Gothic novel, shows a character as very frivolous, where it's not, the problem isn't the novel in general. Henry Tilney, the hero in that novel, is very fond of novels himself. He says to Catherine he's read Gothic novels too. So it's about knowing what kind of literature is respectable and enjoying everything appropriately. It's reading the Gothic novel to the exclusion of all else that's seen as problematic, not reading it per se. Henry Tilney reads Gothic novels, but he also reads history, as does his sister. They're fond of history. So we were trying to get you to think about what a character's reading might signify about them, what it might say about them. Opinions of the novel, the 18th century context, got you looking at another database, a database of production and reception that shows you some of the reviews of Austen's novels when they first came out. I love this resource, and I love watching newcomers to it react to it, because it can be very surprising to see the 18th century views and the amount that 18th century reviews give us plot spoilers. That's always a surprise to people. They give lengthy extracts from the novels themselves. And we wanted to get you thinking about why they might do that. Well, one reason, of course, is that in the period, novels are extremely expensive. Jane Austen herself owned hardly any. She was a member of the subscription library in Alton when she lived at Chawton, but she didn't own her own books. So one purpose of the reviews would be that that people would buy them to see if it would be worth spending the money on the actual books themselves. Some people have suggested that it may have been a way to get a sense of what one should have or might read without actually purchasing and reading that. And I think that's absolutely true. You know, get a sense of what's going on, gives you some cultural capital. If you've read the reviews, you don't necessarily have to have read the works themselves. Then, as now, of course, I mean, that's the function of some major reviews like the London Review of Books or the Times Literary Supplement. We read them because it gives us a sense of what's going on. We don't necessarily read the books themselves. So keeping abreast of cultural capital is as important for Jane Austen's contemporaries as it is for us. We also got you thinking about Austen's readers more broadly in one of the first tasks when we sent you to the Reading Experience database, and we got you to think about Charlotte Bronte's response to Jane Austen. Now, I always find that fun. People are very indignant at Charlotte Bronte's response, but of course what we're trying to do is to get you to think of rival authors and a sense that a sense of Austen's celebrity and a sense of where it came from. So we treat her now exactly how as exactly what she is. She's a canonical author. She's an author who's been well established as one of the greats of English literature. But this wasn't always the case. And in the 19th century, her reputation was solid and respectable. She's never been out of print, but she wasn't the not to be touched canonical writer. And Charlotte Bronte, there's certainly a sense of a sort of rivalry there between these two great women writers of the 19th century, because although we talk about Austen in terms of the long 18th century, of course she didn't publish anything until 1811, the Regency period. She's a 19th century author too. So it's interesting to think about what people thought of Austen, what they've thought of her over the years. And there's a very direct question in the roundup section this week that asks, well, Austen's mainly read by women, isn't she? There's certainly a bit of a perception that she's mainly read by women now, but it's not true, I think, and it certainly wasn't true in the 19th century. Austen was very much writing for all of her peers, that novel reading wasn't particularly gendered, and there's no sense that her first admirers were anything other than canonical figures themselves. So Walter Scott is a very good example. I directed you in the comments this week to Walter Scott's review of Emma that appeared in the Quarterly Review in 1816, and Walter Scott was a great admirer of Jane Austen, and there have been many defenders of her novels in the 19th and early 20th century who were men. So she's not just a women's writer. She's not just for women readers, although certainly it is the case that women have enjoyed and appreciated her works over the years as much as men have. We got you to have a think about Austen's attitude to her own contemporaries via her comments on a reading of Mary Brunton's work, Self-Control. Now, Mary Bronte is an interesting figure to think about, and it brings me on nicely to this question of anonymity in the period, or women writers who published their books either anonymously or pseudonymously or by a lady. Now, Jane Austen herself very famously published her first novel as By a Lady. And then after that, it tended to be, so that was Sense and Sensibility, published by a lady. And after that, it tended to be that she published by the author of Sense and Sensibility, and then by the author of Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, when those two novels had been published. But her first appearance in print was definitely under the label By a Lady. We are not sure who chose that. Was it her publisher? Was it her? It was not uncommon in the period to publish anonymously, and that goes for men and women too. Walter Scott's novels were never published with his name attached to them in his lifetime, although it was a widely known secret that Walter Scott was the author of Waverley. Jane Austen herself talks about it in one of her letters. The question is somewhat more vexed for a woman writer, of course, and I want to read you a little extract from Mary Brunton on the topic of why she wanted to remain anonymous. To be pointed at, to be suspected of literary airs, to be shunned as literary women are. I would sooner exhibit as a rope dancer. I love that. It gives a sort of sense of the real notoriety that women writers had when they went public with authorship. But it's a mistake to think that women couldn't publish under their own names, or indeed that they didn't. Maria Edgeworth, Austen's contemporary, one of the two women writers that Austen alludes to directly in Northanger Abbey as the author of Belinda. So Maria Edgeworth wrote Belinda in 1802. Jane Austen refers to it in Northanger Abbey. The great Maria was one of the leading novelists of the period, and everyone knew it was Maria Edgeworth who was publishing those works. She was named. So, question of anonymity, we have to be a bit careful about saying, oh, woman couldn't write, woman couldn't publish. It's not quite the same for Jane Austen's generation as it became for later writers. So, for example, the Brontes are a very good example there of women writers who adopted male pseudonyms. Finally, this question of by a lady, this brand by a lady. There is documentary evidence, book historian James Raven has come across it, that some of these ladies that were publishing novels in the period were actually men. So it's interesting to think about why that may be. What is it with the label by a lady that's particularly appealing for publishers of novels and indeed for their readers? So you can keep thinking about that as the course continues. We try in this course to get you to think about what we know about Jane Austen and how we know it. And we're going to be doing much more of that next week when we get on to thinking about Austen's biography and of the first biographical portrait by her brother Henry Austen, and then later by her nephew James Edward Austen Leigh. And someone asked a direct question about letters in the novel and how they've always very much enjoyed the letters in the novel. And is there any similarity between the letters that Austen wrote? That's a hard question to answer. I mean, certainly I would recommend all of you read Austen's letters. The edition by Deirdre Le Fay is the best edition. It's very affordable, and you can have a look at Austen's writing style in her letters to her predominantly her sister Cassandra. That's what most of the letters that have come down to us were written to her sister when they were absent. There are big gaps. And it's always interesting to think about these gaps in the letters. So in 1809, she moved to the village of Chawton and had a stable home for the first time since her father had died. So they'd had the Austen woman, her mother, her sister Cassandra, and Jane herself had quite an itinerant lifestyle up until their move to the village of Chawton in 1809. He writes a letter on the move to Chawton, and then for 2 years we get nothing. And it's very frustrating because those 2 years are years in which we know she must have been extremely active. She was putting the finishing touches to Sense and Sensibility. She was getting that published. She was working on the manuscript of Pride and Prejudice too. You know, she's working up to what was going to be a very active publishing years in the final years of her life after the move to Chawton in 1809 and before her death in 1817. But we have no record of what she was doing in that period. We've got no letters from that period at all. Of course, scholars have argued over the years that both Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility started life as epistolary novels, so that is novels in letters. there's very little evidence of this. We don't, of course, have the manuscripts of any of Austen's novels. And that was something else we wanted you to think about this week, was why are there no manuscripts? Why are there no manuscripts of Jane Austen's published works? And a few of you have got, I think, the exact reason why in the comments to that section of the course, which is that once the works were published, the Austen family and Jane Austen herself saw no reason to keep them. We would love to have those manuscripts now, but once the works were published, there was no point in having them anymore, and indeed the publishers wouldn't have had the space to keep them, and would have seen no reason to do so. The finished product was the printed novel itself. The manuscript had done its job by the time that was published. So I hope I've given you some things to keep thinking about, some suggestions for further reading, and I hope you'll enjoy next week of the course when we get to thinking more about Austen's life and the social context in which she's publishing her fiction. Please remember that all the databases that we've given you access to this week are independent of this course. So you can return to the Reading Experience database, you can return to the Godmersham Park Library, and you can return to the Cardiff database of production and reception whenever you like. Make a note of those resources and bookmark them. They are there for you independently of this course. And do keep commenting in the comments box in response to the individual steps of the course. As I say, we always enjoy reading, we as tutors always enjoy reading how you're responding to this material, but I know too that it's very helpful for other participants on the course to see that there's an engaged learning community. So once again, enjoy the rest of the course. Next week we're going to be looking at Austen's biography. We're going to be looking at gardens. We're going to be looking at music in the period, and particularly money and capital and social capital in Austen's fiction. So I do hope you enjoy that, and I wish you a very good weekend. Thank you.